everyone. As promised, we are back right on time with Literature and Libations with Andy Borbely. I first met Andy way back in the day at Cooter Brown's when he was behind the bar, and we really bonded over not only our love for a good cocktail, but also our love for books and reading. And Andy has been a huge supporter of One Book, One New Orleans. Every time we ask him to do something, he cheers us on enthusiastically. He brings his time, his talent, his resources to literacy efforts. And when we were talking with Andy about doing this, what he basically said is, I collect stories when I'm behind the bar, and I've been doing this for 20 years. And bars and restaurants are really these healthy nodes of community and they're places of refuge. So he really sort of took what he learned behind the bar, and now he's using that knowledge with the language of fine spirits. And he really combines these things to tell stories of his own with not only cocktail, but with words. And we're really excited because when we talked about this demonstration and how he sort of uses cocktails as his own language, he said, why don't I just create something for the festival, a brand new cocktail, and debut it live? And we said, okay, of course. Yes, please do. So here to debut the Bitter Southerner 2020 is Andy Borbely.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Like Megan said, she and I go way back from an initial introduction and story exchange and relationship building at Cooter Brown's Bar, one of my favorite nodes of community, as we mentioned earlier, in the greater New Orleans area. I've been behind a bar for about 20 years, and what's kept me there is a sense that bars and restaurants are one of the only places in America that we really have left, in my opinion, where everybody comes to mingle. The only thing that everybody has in common is that you've got $3 for the bartender and a dollar to tip. And other than that, the bar stool is yours. You bring with you your stories, you bring with you your experiences, oftentimes your troubles. And it's a place where people of all different types of interests and backgrounds really come to meet in really real space. You aren't necessarily picking someone, say, in a sports league or a religious affiliation or even an academic background. You have a really diverse group of people coming to exchange ideas and share themselves with each other, because at the end of the day, it's always cheaper, less expensive to have that very same cocktail at home. You are coming to a bar and a restaurant to exchange those stories and to grow your own humanity by interacting very closely with other people. It's one of the things that here in 2020 we miss very dearly. And here, by contributing to the festival, it's something that I'm very excited for, because everyone here casts a very big shadow, even in ways that you might not think. I find you all very inspirational. I was listening to Cortez's segment with the young poets this morning as I was doing my setup here in my kitchen, and it just was very touching to me that we have the ability to interact and exchange in this way. And your language is words, and your language is the printed page. Your language is streaming together your thoughts to make them very beautiful and very expressive. My language is cocktails and fine spirits. And one of the moments where I really made the leap from being just a guy standing behind a bar, cracking bottles and serving them out to people, to being somewhat of a storyteller or somewhat of a knowledgeable person was when I looked back at my back bar, and it occurred to me that all of these spirits, all of these bottles on the bar uniquely had their own stories. They had backgrounds, they had history. And then once I crossed paths with them, it was up to me to combine them in certain ways to cast that story forward. And I remember very specifically, Frangelico, if you've ever seen one of those, I thought the bottle was shaped very oddly. And I just did a little looking up. I would say typing, but this was so long ago that the internet wasn't really a place where you could go for spirits knowledge. I had to cocktail book, and I found out that the shape of the bottle of Frangelico was in the shape of an Italian monk. That seemed kind of weird, so I did the recipe, and I looked up a little deeper, and I found out that the recipe came from an order of monks in Italy that had been making this bottle for hundreds of years, and that in addition to hazelnuts, they gather all of the sort of flowers and botanicals from the Italian hillside in this secret recipe and put it together for this sweet little bottle of booze that tastes like hazelnuts that you put in your coffee. And I never looked at that bottle the same way again. And as a matter of fact, I never looked at any bottles the same way again. So here today, what I'd like to do is to give you a couple of glimpses into the stories behind a couple of prominent bottles. It's turkey season, so we're going to talk a little bit about wild turkey, which is a Southern favorite. And I would also like to walk you through a cocktail demonstration so that you can utilize some of our tips and techniques for how to create your own cocktails that you can share with meaningful people in your lives, your family, your loved ones. And I also want to tell a couple of stories, debunk a couple myths, and talk a little bit about how the legacy and stories of some prominent authors and fictional characters either hold up or don't hold up. Because when we all, put our stories onto a page, bartenders pay attention. We're going to talk a little bit about, the legend of Ernest Hemingway, Hunter S. Thompson. We can even get into a little James Bond, Casino Royale, because all of these people have created a mythos around them that is worth investigating and talking about. So what I would like to start off by doing is by telling you the very first story that I created. We kind of established that I'm in this mindset that, wow, all these bottles have unique history. And the first thing to do in my career was to learn all of those stories. They say before you can become a wonderful writer, you first have to be, a prolific reader. Cortez even said that this morning in his in his presentation. He said he thinks of himself as a reader, and I spent years doing that. I spent years doing that at a very fortunate time, in the sense that the whiskey boom as we know it right now and the cocktail boom hadn't really gone off yet. So I was very lucky to start personal relationships with people who would go on to become superstars. So I like to joke that before I moved to New Orleans, I lived in Central Illinois, and we were only about 4 hours from the Bourbon Trail. So we would go there quite often, and we would roll up to distilleries before they had visitor centers, which now are, booked weeks in advance for tours. And we would send emails and have correspondence with master distillers who now are just superstars. But back in the day, if you showed up on a Tuesday with 3 friends, living legends would walk you around the distillery. It was sort of like knowing the Beatles before they, cut their record, like when they were just a coffee shop band in the corner. And that's one of the reasons why I have a unique relationship with wild turkey. And it's one of the reasons why I put it into the Bitter Southerner is, a little tongue in cheek, it's turkey season. Well, we've got Thanksgiving coming up. And also wild turkey has for a very long time been a staple of Southern culture. But the paterfamilias of the wild turkey family is a man named Jimmy Russell. Jimmy is a living legend in the bourbon world. If you were to make the very, very short list of Hall of Famers, Jimmy would be right on top of it. And what made him famous is that he has been working at the Wild Turkey Distillery for over 6 decades. I have to continually go and refresh my memory of how many years Jimmy has been there, because it's over 6 decades. And what makes Jimmy really wonderful is that he embodies tradition. And that's a word that you see kicked around a lot. Speaking of the power of words, tradition is kicked around a lot in Kentucky bourbon world. Jimmy embodies that. Jimmy has done the same thing over and over and over, and represented this pillar of excellence that is unrivaled in the world of bourbon. both because he's done it for so long and because he's done it so well. He learned to distill from the titans of the Wild Turkey brand, and he grew up just 3 or 4 miles from the distillery that he now runs. So he's hometown excellence embodied. And one of the things that I feel very proud to say is that Jimmy took the time early in my career to take me and 3 of my employees around for a tour of Wild Turkey. These days, again, Jimmy's a superstar. Jimmy's son, Eddie, has worked at the distillery for about 40 years and is still, second man up. Jimmy hosted us at the distillery one day when we pulled up in a car, and it was around lunchtime. He looked at us with all of these decades of experience and says, yeah, I'm going to show you around this distillery, but are you guys hungry? You guys want to go to lunch? And we kind of looked at each other and we said, yeah, that'd be great. We could eat. And so we were expecting him to pull some sandwiches out of the visitor center refrigerator or whatever. This living legend of the bourbon world was like, all right, let's go. Grabs his keys to his black Lincoln Town Car, piles us all in there. We went to a little diner a couple miles from the distillery in town, walk in, and it was everything you would expect out of a Kentucky sort of movie set diner almost. And, we walk in, the only 4 faces that people don't recognize. And there's a table populated with 12, 15 dudes between the age of 6 or 40 and 60, 70. And, Jimmy looks at them all. He's like, hey, Dave, Johnny, Harland, Jimmy, Tommy, Tommy, whatever. We sit down and we're like, who is that, Jimmy? And he goes, oh, that was the sheriff, the mayor, the dog catcher, 3 members of the county board, and the coroner. I mean, it was amazing. We sat down, we had this little blue plate lunch with Jimmy, went back to the distillery and did all these really cool things that we could nerd out about. He took us into the warehouse and we cracked open barrels. He took us into the still, and they were actually shut down for the season. They were cleaning the inside of the still, so we actually got to stick our heads inside of it and look up into it. So this Wild Turkey cocktail that I'm about to make for you, it has deep roots for me. So one of the things that I would like everybody to take a look at or to consider as we go through this is the language of how to assemble component parts into a cocktail to make it interesting. I want to put an emphasis on the notion that recipes should be guidelines. Everybody has their own tasting cocktails. You can tell a story a lot of different ways. And that's one of the great aspects of this creative endeavor is some people like their cocktails a little stronger. Some people like them a little sweeter. Some people like them a little more bitter. So every time you see a cocktail recipe that's an original, you should look at that as something that you can modify to fit your tastes. I like to tell people that cocktails are like automobiles. They're like sports cars. You can customize them and you can fix them when they're broken. Sometimes when I was a bartender, I would put a cocktail down in front of someone and they'd sort of wrinkle their nose. I said, okay, are you not enjoying that? And first people would be polite, of course, but then they would oftentimes sort of, confide in me the fact that it just really wasn't doing it for them. I was like, okay, well, what seems to be the problem? Is it too sweet, too sour? And, I can pull that back from behind the bar, add a few dashes of this, a few dashes of that, put it back down in front of them, and they're like, oh, this is so much better. So as I go through this recipe for the Bitter Southerner 2020, I want everybody to keep in mind that if you make this at home after you see it in the publication and you sort of wrinkle your nose, just ask yourself, what are the component parts of this cocktail and maybe what needs to be tweaked? So the basis of most cocktails are always a spirit. So we like to say that cocktails are kind of divided into the spirit or the strength, sweet, sour. And some people believe in their philosophy or their way of writing or conveying a cocktail that these 3 components should be perfectly balanced, like a perfect triangle. Like when you taste it, it should be equal parts strength, sour, sweet. Some people believe that you can manipulate those to sort of make different balances. I happen to be one of those people, but I take a little bit of a twist in that I think that you should always have something sweet, something sour or bitter, of course, the spirit, and then something else to make it interesting. I think that a cocktail really requires 4 parts. This is my Andy Borbely original, because I believe that our palates are trained to taste 3 things individually, but the point at which you introduce a 4th thing, it becomes more like one thing that you sort of see it as the comprehensive whole. And real quickly, before we do the Bitter Southerner 2020, I'll give you an example of that. So if I put rum in front of you and you were to just take a sip of rum, you could taste that no problem. Some people don't like that. So if I put rum and Coke in front of you, that to you tastes like rum and Coke. Okay, pretty easy at this point still. You don't even necessarily need to have a very trained palate. If I were to put rum and Coke in front of you and squeeze a lime into it, you would identify that as rum and Coke with a lime, right? This isn't rocket science. But if I were to throw in rum, Coke, lime, and some mole bitters, or rum, Coke, lime with a pecan smoked vermouth to wash the glass with, all of a sudden those things all kind of come together, and you see this as like one thing. Your brain can't really tease it out into their individual components, and all of a sudden you see the whole thing all put together. And that's one of the things that I really love. So here in the Bitter Southerner 2020, we have wild turkey. There's an easy way and a hard way to do this. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. Wild turkey, black coffee, simple syrup, which is just simple syrup is sugar and water, and then black coffee. And then a product's called El Guapo Chicory Pecan Bitters. Bitters are very botanically intense products that you use to add complexity to a cocktail. So you actually see a bunch of bottles behind me, and that's actually my collection of bitters. I didn't even set this up for this. This is where they live. But the idea behind bitters is that they go a little bit goes a long way. Many of them actually have a history. Before they were used in cocktails, they were almost used as stomach remedies back in the day, just because again you're incorporating in the case of what we're going to use today, chicory, pecan, some gentian, like sort of botanical elements that were used for other things, and now we use them to make cocktails delicious. So one of the things that I thought would be really interesting for this cocktail, I had wild turkey, strong dark coffee together with simple syrup, and then very southern chicory pecan bitters. I thought it would be really cool if we could add an element of depth to this cocktail by bringing it into the kitchen. And there's there are so many stories that come out of Southern kitchens. The kitchen should be the beating heart of a Southern home. And one of the things that I love to incorporate into my cocktails is brown butter. So what we're actually going to do is we are going to incorporate brown butter fat washed wild turkey. So what that means is we have a bottle of wild turkey back here. This is just standard off the shelf wild turkey 101. And then this is my bottle of brown butter fat washed wild turkey. There's going to be a little bit of a color difference, you see. Brown butter is basically butter that you cook on the stove to evoke what's called the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction is anytime you take sugars and you add heat to them and they sort of brown and caramelize, that is adding flavor and depth into whatever it is that you are cooking. So in this case, we're going to take some regular old unsalted butter. And to start the setup, what I encourage is if you're going to do this at home, make sure that you use about 4 tablespoons of butter, but you have to create a little bit of room in your bottle of wild turkey. So it's handy to have a flask. That's the pro tip. If you don't have a flask, you can just send it right on down the chute. But you're going to have to watch yourself because you're cooking with stuff on the stove, so don't get too tipsy as you make your brown butter. So After this step, the next one is going to be to put that butter in a pan and start heating it up. This is a pretty basic photograph, but it's used to illustrate one very important thing, and that is you want to use a pan with a neutral color to it. I love my cast iron, again, staple of a Southern kitchen, but if you use your cast iron, you won't be able to keep an eye on this process quite as diligently. So you want to use a stainless steel or a neutral color pan. So next in the process, you're going to see what happens when we start to add a little heat. You want to use medium, high heat. Either is fine. You just want to keep in mind that the higher the heat, the faster you're going to have to move. So the first thing that's going to happen is the butter is going to melt, and you're going to see the milk solids separating from the butter fat. Butter fat's going to be the clear stuff. The milk solids are the things on the bottom. And then the next step in the process here is what happens as it continues. You're going to see some foam start to rise up at the top. Around the time you see the foam, you're going to want to keep this stuff moving. You can even see in this photograph here that it's sort of tilted to the left. That's because with my other hand that I'm not taking this photograph with, I was moving this pan around to make sure that, you know, the butter's circulating, it's not hanging out in one particular place and getting singed. What happens next in the process is it should start to take on some color. You're going to start to see more of a chestnut color rising. Those milk solids at the bottom are going to start exhibiting the signs that they have, you know, taken on. They've undergone the Maillard reaction. That's kind of what this looks like. And at this juncture, you want to start to use many of your senses. So you want to start to smell. And in addition to having that color of chestnuts, it's actually going to start to smell a little sweet, a little nutty, and you're going to notice that these are all signs that you're adding this additional flavor. It doesn't just smell and taste like butter anymore. It has this really interesting depth. So next, you're going to want to keep an eye on how far you take this process. I like to stop about here. When those milk solids at the bottom start to look like, you know, sort of medium well done toast, there will also be a change in how the brown butter smells. It will smell a little bit more like toast, less like nuts, more like toast. If you're using a medium to medium high heat, you can pull it off, you know, about here, and you'll generally be fine. What you don't want is for those milk solids to turn black. And again, what I like to do is I like to keep just like a porcelain bowl or like a cereal bowl next to my pan, so that right at that minute that it starts to look like that, I just pour it right in there, and that it's no longer sitting in that hot pan. It's no longer taking on any of the heat from the hot pan. Just take it off the heat, and it's a quick stop. So if you've got your brown butter, next, what we're going to do with it is we're going to introduce it to our bourbon. And you're going to pour it in. You use a funnel if you need to. Make sure you get all those milk solids in there. It's going to look gross at this point. That is totally expected. It's fine. It's just not going to look pretty for a little while, because what you're going to want to do is you're going to add your butter into there, cap it, of course, make sure your thumb's on it really well. Give it a really good shake. You want to introduce all of those, you know, butter fats and milk solids throughout, and really make sure that you're shaking it pretty vigorously. Next thing, what you're going to do is you're going to add it to the fridge, and it's going to look even more gross. Totally fine. Again, if it looks like this, you're right on the money. You want to keep it in your fridge for about 2 or 3 days. And again, you know, when you wake up in the morning and you have your coffee, you know, open your fridge, give this thing a shake. You don't need to babysit it at this point. You could keep it in there for 3 days. You could keep it in there for a week. This is the opposite of what it looks like when it's on the heat. You don't have to be really quick on your trigger finger with this. You can let this go for a pretty long time. Next, what you're going to do is take it and dump it out. You can use just the wire strainer that you probably have in your kitchen first. I did a double strain with this one, and bartenders are sort of notorious for using any tool that we have on hand. I'm going to tell you honestly, I wanted to put it through a fine strainer to get all those chunky butter parts out of it. But then I wanted to go a little bit finer on the strainer. And I know that Candace has the photographs up, but if you can see me here on the side, I also just used the coffee basket from my coffee machine. This is a very helpful tool in the world of bartending. We use these things kind of a lot. I put that thing through the ringer or through the strainer. But so you do that first initial one to get the big chunky ones, and then you can actually strain it so that the end product has a lot more of a fine, sort of like smooth mouthfeel and consistency. Go ahead and hit the next one, Candace. This is what it's going to look like at the very end. So this is your brown butter fat washed wild turkey. Again, this is going to have some richness, some umami to it. Another culinary term there that's going to provide a background to the sort of the alcohol and the caramels and the vanillas. Again, we're kind of matching up all of these flavors. So bourbon gets a lot of its flavor from the oak barrel that it rests in. What happens when bourbon is resting is that over the years, the reason that years are important is during the wintertime, the cellular structure of the barrel will contract and it will squeeze a lot of the moisture back into the barrel. In the summertime, the cellular structure expands and a lot of the bourbon will penetrate the wood and absorb a lot of the caramel and vanilla and oak tannins. And then in the wintertime, it gets squeezed back in again. And so as you go through this seasonal cycle of expansion and contraction, you're really just it's like dunking a tea bag, right? Like these barrels are actually moving, they're actually breathing. That's why the cycle of a year is important, and that's why Kentucky is very good for aging bourbon. But the reason I bring it up is because you're in that aging process, you're introducing caramels, vanillas. These are flavors that go very well with butter, like buttery vanilla, pastries and, caramel, butter, vanilla. I mean, they all sort of go together. So, why not add that additional element of flavor? So that's what it looks like when it's all filtered and done. And I'm going to show you what it looks like to put it all together. So the Bitter Southerner cocktail, really quick. Pull out your brown butter fat washed wild turkey. They say it takes 6 hours to make a turkey. I just made one in 2 seconds. So 3.5 ounces. I also want to point out before we get going that, again, bartenders are very resourceful people. Yes. If you have one of these, this is called the Yari mixing glass. This is a great tool to have. You add your ice into the bottom of it, and what you're going to do is you're going to use this as the vessel to incorporate all of your ingredients. You get like your long fancy bartender spoon, right? And you stir it. When you're doing this, you're introducing a dilution ratio to your cocktail. When alcohol hits ice, it naturally melts it. It's a good thing because sometimes these ingredients that we're adding are like very tightly condensed. And by adding a little bit of a dilution ratio, they sort of expand and they open up. You can taste them a little bit better. But I figure you at home probably don't have a Yari mixing glass. You might have a shaker tin like this. If you do, that's great. But I think that the most talented bartenders can either go high or they can go low. It's like, public speaking. Sure, you can sit and talk to a room full of intellectuals about your specific PhD, but can you make it interesting to the guy sitting next to you on the bar stool? So we live in New Orleans, so I'm going to make the Bitter Southerner out of a to-go cup that I picked up from my friends at Blue Oak Barbecue. So my wild turkey, we're going to do 3.5 ounces. My jigger has a 2-ounce side. And then we also have in here what we call a ghost line, which means that I can see it, but you can't, where I'm going to hit that line and get 3.5 ounces. Actually, yeah, there we go. So the jiggers have different measurements for bartenders. So sometimes if you're at the bar and you see a bartender pouring your drink and you're like, oh my gosh, he's making that drink. It didn't go all the way up to the top. We're just using the ghost line in there. Yeah, nobody's trying to, hustle you. The other ingredient, in addition to our brown butter, 3/4 of an ounce of that. This is basically sugar and water that I put together in the stove. And I took some black coffee left over from this morning, and I took a saucepan and I heated it up first. So I got my saucepan nice and hot, and I poured that black coffee in there so it sort of steamed up. I want to make this bitter. I want that coffee to be very concentrated. I want to evaporate out a lot of the water, and I incorporated black coffee to my liking into my simple syrup, so that I know the balance of how much bitter to how much sweet I'm going to be putting into this cocktail. The last thing that I'm going to do is the El Guapo Chicory Pecan bitters, 4 to 6 ounces of this, or excuse me, 4 to 6 dashes. 4 to 6 ounces would be really gross. So chicory is a botanical that's near and dear to my heart, because growing up not as a Southerner, we did not eat it in central Illinois. However, it was everywhere, and it was one of my favorite flowers. I worked in nature preserves throughout high school and college, and so I learned a lot of the native plants. And in Illinois, late spring to early summer, you see along all the interstates and along all the country roads and the back roads this beautiful purple flower. And you see it down here too, if you know what to look for, but you see it a lot more in the prairies of Illinois. And this beautiful purple flower is chicory. Well, people would take the chicory root in particular and dry it out and grind it into their coffee to add a little bit more of a bitter flavor to it. So 4 to 6 ounces of this, adding some complexity to our Bitter Southerner 2020. Give it a good stir, again, in the to-go cup, not super fancy. I am going to strain this one with a strainer just because it's easier for me, but the old double cup works just as well if you have 2 to-go cups. If you don't have one of these, I wouldn't do this in a bar because it's not the most perfectly sanitary thing, but just stack them up, one on top of the other, and then you sort of do like the double cup thing. Perfectly fine. We're going to discard that used ice, and we're going to put some fresh ice in there. And again, working from home here in 2020, fridge ice is good, perfectly fine. Just make sure that it's fresh. You don't want old ice lingering in your cocktail, because what happens is if it spends too long in your refrigerator, ice will start to take on the personality of whatever else you got in there. So if you're here in Louisiana, or you're somewhere coastal where you're keeping some frozen fish in there, you do not want your cocktail ice smelling or tasting like fish. So we've got the very southern element of the Wild Turkey 101. We've got the black coffee and simple syrup. We've got the 4 to 6 ounces of El Guapo Chicory Pecan bitters. The thing that I'm going to use to top this off, as far as bitter Southerners go, is a cigar. But for me, again, telling stories very specifically, one of my best friends here in New Orleans named Brock, he and I came across a couple cases of Liga Privada T52s from Drew Estate. These are really delicious cigars. We love them very much. These are kind of, we share our cigar collections. And Brock is from Charleston, South Carolina, very southern city, in case you guys haven't heard of it. Brock's little sister was getting married in Charleston, and it was a very big deal. And so to celebrate his sister's wedding, he sort of inquired. He's like, hey, can we make a trade? I would like to take, these T52 cigars to my sister's wedding. And I said, yes, it's a very special occasion. Go ahead and take the big boys, but just leave me one. Like, I would really like to enjoy this. So he took a case, I took one, and I'm going to, as my celebratory, tradition today, after this is concluded, I'm going to sit on my porch and smoke my T52 that's been in my humidor for about 2 or 3 years now, and celebrate, the completion of this cocktail and sharing the stories with you. So this is for later. This is for now. Cheers to everybody. I hope you guys make this at home. I hope that if you have any questions or comments, you can probably get back in touch with me via the festival. Megan can feel free to put us in touch. I love helping people with cocktail questions. But now that we have a little bit of time and we've completed our cocktail, it's kind of time to talk about how to incorporate some of these elements that we talked about into the world of literature and writing, and how to adapt what you know about writing and what I know about spirits, and maybe find some middle ground, right? Um, I'll give you a good example of some mythology that stands up and some mythology that sort of doesn't. There's an old story in the world of literature that Ernest Hemingway was down in Cuba, and he was in Havana, and in particular, he walked into the Floridita hotel and bar and asked where the restroom was. So far, story checks out. I can see Ernest Hemingway doing that. He ordered himself up a daiquiri, took a sip of it, and said, you know, I'm not a fan of the sugar. Ernest Hemingway had some pre-diabetes type issues where sugar was kind of an issue for him. So the legend goes that Ernest Hemingway said, make me another one of these with twice the rum and no sugar. And so they whipped it up for him, and all this became Papa Hemingway's drink. I wasn't at the Floridita that day. I didn't sit on the bar stool to witness this. I don't think that checks out all the way. If you have ever consumed rum and lime juice together, it's kind of gross. It's just those two things. Particularly if you're using the Cuban style, dry rum that was popular during that time. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying it's pretty skeptical. It's kind of like making an end table with 2 legs instead of 3. I think that story does not really hold up when pressured quite so much. Again, what do we know about the world of cocktails? Well, you make cocktails with something strong, spirit, something sour, and something sweet. When you take one of those elements away entirely, it doesn't really work. It's just something that's not good. And to kind of continue this mythology that Ernest Hemingway was a very robust drinker, right? Like he just loved these things. I mean, sure, he could have, but I'll tell you 2 things. Number one, that strikes me kind of like someone walking into a bar and taking a shot of Crystal hot sauce and being like, wow, this is delicious. Look at how vigorous of a drinker I am. I just love drinking Crystal hot sauce. Even if you do, it's not projecting the reputation that you think it is. It's just not good. The story continues a little bit in that the bartenders at La Floridita would make a cocktail called the Papa Doble, which was, again, twice the rum with very little sugar. I really doubt that they were just throwing in twice the rum, lime juice and nothing. And the reason I doubt that is because several years after Hemingway stopped frequenting the Floridita, there was a bartender there named Constantine, and Cosentino made modifications to the Papa Doble. And what he did was he incorporated grapefruit juice, and in addition to the lime juice, to sort of add some complexity to it, incorporating different citrus to it to make it a little more bright and interesting. But he also put in maraschino liqueur. And what maraschino liqueur is it's made with maraschino cherries, but also their pits. So it's a liqueur that adds like kind of a nutty, subtle sweetness. And again, this is soft history. I'm not someone who was sitting at the Floridita bar. If he was kind of sliding in maraschino liqueur into the Papa Doble, officially, I feel like they were probably sliding in something moderately to mildly sweet all along. I just think that reputation doesn't really check out. And if you think it does, I encourage you to sometime just look up the recipe for a classic daiquiri and try it with twice the lime or twice the rum and no sugar. It's not really great. But, in the world of literature, one of the people who really did, by all accounts, walk the walk and talk the talk was another fan of Wild Turkey, Hunter S. Thompson. Was from Louisville, Kentucky. carried with him a lifelong love of bourbon, and as we know, other substances as well. But everyone who ever met Hunter S. Thompson would tell the story of his sort of mythology, just that he was a man of prolific appetites, even from fine spirits to other substances to breakfasts. One of the crazy things about him was that there's a journalist who met him for a meeting one day and said that he showed up and they were going to have a breakfast meeting, and Hunter S. Thompson pulled out the menu and was ordering pancakes and omelets and scones and bacon and all these things, and the waiter laughed and he's like, picture of Bloody Marys, and the waiter was like, where are the other 4 people in your party? We don't have room on the table to put all this stuff. And the journalist said throughout the course of the interview, Hunter S. Thompson just sat and ate everything. So it does really check out, that the man would sort of drink the same way. There are, in the mythology of spirits, the story goes that the Bloody Mary cocktail was actually invented by the staff at Harry's American bar in Paris to keep F. Scott Fitzgerald alive. They said he was drinking gin martinis so prolifically and just slouching in the corner that they said, hey man, we're not going to serve you any more to drink until you get some nutrients in you. So we'll kind of meet you halfway. We'll throw some tomato juice in here and we'll put some vodka in it for you, because that sort of seems to be the bare minimum that you need. But we'll also garnish it with all kinds of celery and olives and cheese or whatever. Like you have to eat something. So again, that mythology, I don't know whether he was the specific one that they sort of made that up for. Again, I wasn't on the bar stool. That's the legend. Seems like it would make sense to me. But one of my personal stories, and you can take this with you as you write in your literature and your poetry. One of the things that I like to do in my language is look at where things grow or how things grow. Again, we go back to the bottle of Frangelico that's made, from botanicals from the Italian mountainsides, right? Once you know that, it's like backstory for a character, and you can combine things in interesting ways. And I'd like to tell you, I got the comment that someone's really loving the stories. So here's one that is nearest and dearest to me. The first cocktail that I ever made that incorporated a narrative story was one that I made in tribute to my grandparents, and I called it the Desert Rose. And the story goes that my grandfather and my grandmother lived on the south side of Chicago, and during World War II, my grandfather enlisted and was promptly shipped off to do his basic training out in the deserts of California. He was a tank operator, and he was in the 6th Armored Division under General Patton. So when he was doing his tank training out in the desert, he started writing letters to his fiancée, my grandmother. He would write a letter to her every single day, and she would write a letter back to him. So in the beginning of this correspondence, as a joke, his name was Joe, she started referring to him as Cactus Joe. And my grandmother's name was Helen, but Cactus Joe was a bit of a romantic. So he would tell my grandmother, he would refer to her as his Desert Rose. He said it was the most, beautiful thing that the desert, showed him, that didn't show it to him very often, but when it did, it took his breath away. So he would take that memory of her with him into war, that someday he would see her again, and they would be reunited. But in the meantime, it was the memory of the Desert Rose that would sustain him. So she actually flew out to California before he went overseas. They got married out in California, sort of not really a shotgun wedding, but a darn quick one. And she went back to Chicagoland, and he deployed, and he rolled tanks around North Africa and then up through France and into Eastern Europe. And in a tank division, after World War II, he was kept there for a very long time because the tanks were then used to clear rubble in the rebuilding. And my grandfather was one of the only people in his division who spoke Hungarian. So they kept him even longer. And throughout this whole time, he was writing letters to my grandmother. So my dad tells the story that when he was a little kid down in their basement, they had these pirates' chests of hundreds and hundreds of letters tied up in string and in bundles. And they were the chronicles of Cactus Joe and Desert Rose. And throughout the war, he was writing letters to her prolifically. And at some points, Army censors essentially would open up the letters, and there were portions of my grandmother's letters that were blacked out, not because he was so silly enough to say, like, oh, hey, we're going to be moving from this town to that town, but he was describing the clouds or the weather patterns or a bird that he saw, and they thought that could be construed as sensitive, so they blacked it out. But my grandmother basically over the years kept hundreds of these letters, again, in 2 giant chests tied up in like bundles of 20. And when I decided to start telling cocktail stories through cocktails, well, the first thing I did was, I'm going to call it the Desert Rose. My grandmother's like near and dear to my heart as well. So what I did was I started with a philosophy that if it grows together, it goes together, which is a culinary sort of tenet that you can sort of apply in your cooking as well. So I decided that I was going to start with a spirit called tequila parmiamante, which is tequila for my lover. So what you do is you take reposado tequila and fresh in-season strawberries. They really do have to be fresh. Don't bother if the strawberries are like irradiated and red on the outside, white in the middle. Ponchatoula strawberries in season are perfect for this. So you basically take about 1 liter of reposado tequila, cut up some strawberries to give it some better surface area, 5 or 6 pieces per strawberry, and then just combine them. It doesn't have to be rocket science. You just put them in a big jug together, maybe an iced tea pitcher, and just let it sit. Let it sit for 2 weeks. And what happens is when you're done with that, the strawberries come out bleached and white. Your tequila all of a sudden is beautiful pink rose color. It's also very delicious. So starting with that as a base, keep in mind, sweet, sour, spirit, something else. I had my spirit. So for the sour, tequila and lime is a natural combination. I did a little bit of lime. For the sweet, Grandpa Joe, Cactus Joe, spent a little bit of time rolling through France as well on his trip to Eastern Europe. So I used Saint Germain elderflower liqueur, which is both floral, but it's very, very sweet. So to use it as the sweetening agent. And then, so I've got my spirit, the tequila. I've got my sour lime juice. I've got my sweet Saint Germain elderflower. But at this point, it was still tasting like that rum and Coke and lime. I needed something else. And so what I decided to do at that point was to take sage, just fresh sage, desert sage. If it grows together, it goes together. And I combined that with some high-proof Ray and Nephew overproof rum, macerated that, and I basically made a couple of other things in there to make sage bitters, very similarly to your chicory pecan bitters, right? I used very large amounts of sage. So I'd add a few dashes of that in there, and all of a sudden now you've got your sweet, sour, spirit, something else, and you have the story of Cactus Joe and Desert Rose in a glass. And it is near and dear to my heart every time I serve it. I think of them in particular, and it's a way to express stories through cocktails. So I encourage everybody, as you try to overlay some of your literature, and thank you, someone just said they were in tears. Thank you, Candace. As you write your literature, keep in mind that there are opportunities for stories everywhere. Even just, looking behind me here, how many times have you seen this bottle of Angostura bitters on every back bar ever? Well, the story with this is this was originally made in Venezuela until someone, went across the sea up to Trinidad, and it's made the very secret recipe. I look at this bottle now because I went down to Trinidad and I wanted to see where this was made. And their global ambassador, Raymond Edwards, is a friend of mine. And, looking at my things on this is actually a swizzle stick that Raymond gave me from an actual swizzle tree. It's a bartender tool that you use. You put it together in your hands and you mix like this. But there are stories everywhere. And I encourage you in your writing to keep in mind that you can utilize in your writing. If you're going to write about spirits, my hope is that you do a little bit of research because your bartenders will be checking you. A really great example, I know that we're kind of in our last 10 minutes here, but like a really great example is Ian Fleming in Casino Royale. Dropped the shaken, not stirred James Bond's martini, right? There's a couple things about the James Bond Vesper martini that came out of that. He actually put the recipe in print. So bartenders a lot of times go to Casino Royale, the book, and put that recipe onto their cocktail list. There's a problem with that, in that one of the ingredients that Ian Fleming put into the Vesper cocktail called for quina lillet. Quina lillet is essentially an aperitif that's made in France, and it's kind of like a vermouth. It has a little bit of a bittering agent to it. Well, the recipe for quina lillet was modified in the 1980s and is now different than what Ian Fleming wrote in his book. So if you go to the book, even if you follow, religiously to the T, in the 80s, palates were trending sweeter. And so quina lillet changed their recipe and dropped a lot of the quinine out of their original recipe. So it was less bitter. So if you're actually making that to the exact instructions with today's ingredients, you will be making it incorrectly, in fact. And the line, so you have to make a modification. You have to add some kind of another bittering agent. You can do that a lot of different ways. But you'll see bartenders oftentimes will add an extra infusion into their quina lillet if they're making a proper, emphasis on proper, Vesper. Again, recipes are starting points, right? No harm in making a Vesper martini any way you want it, as long as you articulate that that it's different than what was in the original book, right? Like, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, right? So go ahead and riff if you want, but just know exactly what you're doing. Going to the James Bond well one last time. We already talked about what happens when spirit hits ice. It dilutes into it. Bartenders cried foul when Ian Fleming made James Bond's martini shaken, not stirred. By shaking a martini, what you do is inside the glass, the ice cubes are both coming into contact with the spirit and melting, but also they're colliding with each other. They're breaking off into tiny little shards, creating more surface area to interact with that alcohol, and they're melting at a much faster rate. So if you actually stir a cocktail and dump it versus shake a cocktail very hard and dump it, you'll have two very different levels. One will have more dilution into it. So bartenders are saying, well, why in the world would this, very masculine, manly man by the traditional standards, why would he order this cocktail shaken, not stirred? It doesn't make any sense. And Ian Fleming promptly, looked for ways to answer that question and responded back, oh, he does that so that he doesn't get as drunk so that he can still shoot straight. So, I think it was a great comeback. I don't necessarily know if he wrote it that way intentionally. Megan just posted through, if you could have a cocktail with any author, living or dead, who would it be and what would you drink? It's a really good question. And, I think I tipped my hand just a little bit by bringing in the Hunter S. Thompson, although I'm nowhere near as wild as he is. So I'm actually going to go personal, Megan, and I'm going to say I would like to have and you're going to make me tear up a little bit. I'd like to have a desert rose cocktail with Cactus Joe. I'd like to share that with him. I'd like to see if that that holds up. I did not I did not expect that. Wow, thanks. Great question. We're running pretty close to time. Does anybody have any other questions about cocktails, cocktail history as it appears in literature? Okay, well, I would like to offer one thing or request one thing of everyone watching this video. I've been so impressed with just the depth and the quality of all the contributors here at One Book, One New Orleans. And if any of our creative folks who have contributed to the festival would like to go on record as chronicling what they like to drink, I think that it's very important. We know that we know the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Bloody Marys. We know the story, true or not, of Ernest Hemingway. Tennessee Williams was a huge fan of Ramos Gin Fizzes, which themselves all have, that cocktail has a tremendous history as well. Here in New Orleans, Bar Tonique on Rampart Street, Bar Tonique actually shares a back wall with Tennessee Williams' old residence. And Tennessee Williams was, a prolific drinker of Ramos Gin Fizzes. And we have that as part of our collective New Orleans history. We know that because he was here. There are still, local legends of, who drank what and where. And I would really like for you to contribute either in the comments here or in an email to Megan or Candace or someone. If you're a writer here in New Orleans, I would be very curious to know, what are you drinking? Where do you drink it? Do you have a favorite bartender who was influential to you in your writing? And do you frequent any New Orleans establishments for their nodes of community and for those people that you rub elbows with? Do you feel yourself inspired by our city? Because I think that that's an important thing to have in our chronicles of our community. I'd like to know what you drink, where you drink it, and what places in New Orleans are special to you in the bar and spirits world. So I think we're right at about time. We're 12:28. Any other Q&A? Great.
Wow. I don't even know what to say right now. I knew you were an amazing bartender, but honestly, I don't think I've ever you sit down and talk about your family and how they influenced you in your spirit making journey. That was just gorgeous. Thank you so much. And it actually really fittingly segues into our next section, which is Robin Barnes with Baby in Her Lap, playing her music, right? So sort of thinking about the ways that families impact us and who we spend time with and who we choose to call our people is really cool. Also, don't forget, if you like what you see and you would like to support the festival, you can do that in 3 ways. Number 1, you can go to our PayPal and you can just type in wordsandmusicnola@gmail.com, drop a donation there. You can text WAM for Words and Music, to 44321. You can also click the link in the comments section on both Facebook and YouTube. And remember, if you're catching this after the live broadcast is ended, the link is live even when we are not. So, as you know, we usually have in this festival literature and lunch. But since we can't all break bread together, we're going to have midday music and kick back with our lunch, relax to the sounds of Robin Barnes, and maybe after your lunch break, go to wordsandmusic.org and click on that virtual bookstore and buy some of the books to support our local independent bookseller, Tubby and Coos, who is serving us better for this festival. Not only is Tubby and Coos our bookseller, but Candace is the brains behind all of the tech that's going on in this festival. If this festival looks good, it's because of them. So thank you. And we will see you in about 4 minutes with